The world held its breath in the waning days of 1939. Europe had plunged into a war few wanted, yet none seemed able to stop. But amidst the thunder of distant battles and the grim headlines, a curious maritime mystery captured Britain's attention. A ghost ship, really, named the Altmark. Her existence was a thorn in the side of the Royal Navy, a shadow lingering after the dramatic Battle of the River Plate, where the German pocket battleship Graf Spee had met its ignominious end. Now, the British were hunting its elusive supply ship, determined to liberate the nearly 300 British merchant sailors imprisoned within its holds. This wasn't just a pursuit, it was a crusade, a symbol of defiance against the U-boat menace that threatened the very arteries of the British Empire. The Altmark, a vessel of dark utilitarian lines, slipped through the icy embrace of the North Sea, a phantom laden with human misery. Her destination was Germany, her path charting a course perilously close to the neutral, tranquil fjords of Norway. 3 times, Norwegian authorities, upholding the sacred tenets of neutrality, inspected the German ship. 3 times, they found nothing amiss, or so they claimed, and allowed her passage. But the British knew better. They knew the screams of their countrymen were trapped aboard, and the silence of official Norwegian inspection was deafening. The spirit of the Royal Navy, embodied by Captain Philip Vian aboard the destroyer HMS Cossack, could not tolerate such a charade. In a brazen act of defiance against international law and Norwegian sovereignty, the Cossack intercepted the Altmark in Jøsingfjord. What followed was a swift, brutal storming of the ship, a desperate fight for freedom in the confined, cold corridors. The 299 prisoners were liberated, their cheers echoing through the Norwegian night. The Altmark incident wasn't merely a naval skirmish. It was a seismic shock that ripped through the very fabric of Norway's carefully constructed neutrality. The echoes of those cheers, the reports of British Marines boarding a German ship in Norwegian waters, reverberated across the continent. Britain cried foul, accusing Norway of harboring an enemy vessel, of failing to uphold its neutral duties. Germany, incandescent with rage, shrieked about a blatant violation of international law, a weak-kneed betrayal by a nation supposedly committed to impartiality. Norway, caught in this geopolitical vice, suddenly found its carefully cultivated isolation dissolving like mist in the morning sun. The country that had so desperately hoped to remain untouched by the maelstrom of war was now staring into its very eye. Its neutrality, a fragile shield against the tempest, was about to go up in smoke, setting the stage for one of the most audacious and consequential invasions of the Second World War. In the deceptively calm autumn of 1939, when the war was still an abstract concept for many, Norway was little more than a geographical footnote for the major belligerents. Neither Britain nor France, nor even Germany, had given much thought to this elongated Scandinavian nation. The prevailing assumption was that if push came to shove, Norway would naturally align with the Allies, a quiet, maritime democracy, much like their Nordic neighbors. Norway, however, had other ideas. Its foreign policy, carefully orchestrated by Foreign Minister Halvdan Koht, was built upon the bedrock of non-provocative politics. Their hope, a desperate prayer really, was that by remaining scrupulously neutral, by refusing to offer even the slightest hint of favoritism, they could keep the specter of war at bay. They wanted no part in the bloody drama unfolding across Europe, but history, as it so often does, had a cruel twist in store. Norway, despite its fervent desire for peace, was about to be thrust onto center stage, not because of its politics, but because of its geography, and more specifically, because of iron. In 1939, Germany, The voracious industrial engine of Nazi expansion consumed a staggering 22 million tons of iron ore. A full 9 million of those tons, a critical supply for their tanks, guns, and warships, originated from the vast mines of Sweden. During the summer months, this vital ore could be shipped directly from Swedish ports in the Baltic. But when winter descended, freezing the Baltic Sea into an impenetrable sheet of ice, the only viable route for this indispensable raw material was a narrow, precarious lifeline, the Norwegian port of Narvik. Narvik, a name that would soon be etched into the annals of naval warfare. For Britain, a nation perpetually engaged in the brutal calculus of strategic vulnerability, this fact was a beacon, a flashing red light on the map of German war production. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, a man whose mind perpetually hummed with aggressive, unconventional strategies, famously declared that complete stoppage of Swedish exports of iron ore to Germany would, barring unpredictable developments, end the war in a few months. It was a bold claim, perhaps an oversimplification, but it underscored the profound strategic importance of this remote Arctic port. Narvik wasn't just a port, it was the bottleneck, the choke point through which flowed the very lifeblood of the German war machine. The British military strategists began to sketch out audacious plans, laying sea mines in Norwegian waters to interdict shipping, imposing a naval blockade that would effectively seal off the Scandinavian coast. Or, in the most extreme scenario, a direct occupation of northern Norway and even the Swedish ore fields themselves. These were not proposals born of casual speculation. They were the desperate gambits of a nation fighting for its very survival. Initially, Britain, ever mindful of the diplomatic niceties, approached Oslo, requesting permission to land troops on Norwegian soil. The response was a resounding, unequivocal no. Foreign Minister Koht, a man wrestling with the weight of an impossible decision, understood the logic behind Britain's plea. But he also understood the crushing, inevitable blowback that would follow. Any British military presence, he reasoned, would be an open invitation for German armed retaliation, a direct provocation that would shatter Norway's neutrality beyond repair. His heart, he admitted, lay with the Allies. Politically, ideologically, nationally, and personally, my affinity, as well as that of the nation, rested with the Allies, he confided. He was a man torn, his personal convictions pulling him in one direction, his national duty forcing him to resist the relentless pressure from London. The British, in their desperation, were not known for their gentle diplomacy. Still, Koht lamented, the British had a demanding attitude that was difficult to accept and continuously forced their issues onto us instead of negotiating affably. It was a classic colonial-era dynamic, a powerful empire dictating terms to a smaller, neutral nation, cloaked in the urgent rhetoric of wartime necessity. The moral complexities were immense. How could one defend neutrality against aggression if defending it meant allowing the enemy to flourish? How could one condemn the violation of sovereignty if that violation was presented as the only way to shorten a devastating global conflict? These were the impossible questions that haunted the halls of Oslo. As the diplomatic impasse festered, a convenient, if cynical, pretext for action emerged from the frozen plains of Finland. The Winter War, a brutal, seemingly endless conflict between Finland and the Soviet Union, offered a tantalizing new angle. Britain and France, with a straight face, began to develop elaborate occupation plans, ostensibly based on helping Finland. This humanitarian intervention, they argued, would necessitate troop movements through Norway and Sweden, providing a convenient cover for securing the very ore fields they coveted. It was a thinly veiled attempt to achieve their strategic goals under the guise of altruism. But fate, once again, intervened. The Winter War, to everyone's surprise, ended abruptly in March 1940. The pretext vanished, and with it, the Allied plans. Britain was back to square one, their strategic dilemma more acute than ever. Out of options, or so it seemed, the most aggressive voices in London began to rise to prominence. Winston Churchill, ever the advocate for decisive, even reckless, action, pushed harder than anyone for the mining of Norwegian waters and, even more daringly, German rivers. His logic was simple, brutal. If the Germans retaliated, which London fully expected, it would provide the justification for the second part of their plan, code-named R4. R4 was a preemptive strike, a rapid occupation of northern Norway by Allied troops, designed to seize Narvik and seal off the ore route. France, initially hesitant to escalate a conflict that might divert resources from their western front, eventually capitulated. After all, a German attack on Norway might very well weaken German forces arrayed against them, creating a desperately needed advantage. In early April 1940, British troops in Scotland began to prepare, their embarkation orders poised to be issued following the expected German reaction to the British mine-laying operation. The stage was set. The trap was laid. But before the British could make their move, Germany struck first. Germany, too, had been watching Narvik with a keen, anxious eye. They understood its vital importance, not just for their war economy, but as a potential Achilles' heel. The fear that Norway might succumb to British diplomatic pressure, that the Allies might seize the ore route, gnawed at Hitler. This fear was deliberately and expertly amplified by a peculiar, almost theatrical character, Vidkun Quisling. Quisling, the leader of Norway's tiny fascist National Samling Party, was a man consumed by an almost pathological self-importance and a delusional belief in his own influence. In a series of secret meetings with Hitler, he painted a fantastical picture of an imminent Anglo-Norwegian alliance, a looming British invasion, and a Norway ripe for a national socialist coup. He implored Hitler for assistance, promising a compliant government if only Germany would intervene. Hitler, surprisingly, initially rebuffed Quisling. The German Foreign Ministry and many of his seasoned generals distrusted the man, dismissing his claims of widespread influence in Norway as pure fantasy. They saw him for what he was, a deluded opportunist. But the seed had been planted. There were other, more pragmatic German motivations for occupying Norway. While countering a British occupation was the primary, immediate goal, controlling Norwegian coastal naval bases would offer a significant strategic advantage. It would provide the Kriegsmarine with unprecedented flexibility, allowing them to project power further into the Atlantic, bypassing the bottleneck of the North Sea and striking at British shipping with devastating effect. The dream of a submarine war of attrition, of cutting Britain's lifelines, suddenly seemed far more achievable. In January 1940, Hitler, now convinced of the strategic imperative, ordered preparations for Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Norway and Denmark. The task fell to General Nicholas von Falkenhorst, a man known for his meticulous planning. But Hitler's directive was clear. This operation would be defined by secrecy, speed, and above all, breathtaking audacity. Hitler himself considered Weserübung to be particularly daring, in fact, one of the rashest undertakings in the history of modern warfare. Precisely that would ensure its success. He reportedly confessed that the anxiety he would feel until the operation's success would be one of the strongest nervous tensions of his life. This was a gamble of epic proportions, a high-stakes throw of the dice on the grand chessboard of Europe. The plan, accelerated dramatically by the Altmark affair, which had so clearly demonstrated the fragility of Norwegian neutrality, was shockingly bold. It called for some 8,000 troops, carried aboard a clandestine fleet of warships and merchant vessels, alongside 3,500 paratroopers, to execute a surprise landing. Their targets: key Norwegian ports, cities, and airfields, to be seized simultaneously in a single lightning strike. The German troops would present their arrival as a preemptive measure, a necessary intervention to thwart an imminent British invasion. But their orders were unequivocal: use all available force to overcome any Norwegian resistance. The assumption was that once Oslo was secured, King Haakon VII would swiftly surrender, legitimizing the German occupation. To ensure the logistical routes for this audacious plan, German forces would simultaneously invade Denmark, a smaller, easier target that would fall within hours. Not everyone in the German military shared Hitler's enthusiasm for Weserübung. The plan was the brainchild of a small, select group, directly accountable to the Wehrmacht High Command, largely bypassing the individual army, air force, or naval commands. This created significant friction. Luftwaffe officers resented being excluded from the planning, feeling their vital air power role was being underestimated. Some army commanders openly opposed the use of troops earmarked for the crucial invasion of France, fearing it would weaken their primary objective. The Navy, while generally more supportive, harbored deep anxieties about facing the overwhelming might of the British Royal Navy in the open seas. They knew the risks were immense. Yet, with German intelligence suggesting that the British were indeed about to move into Norway, Hitler, ever the gambler, set the date for Weserübung, April 9th. As British troops in Scotland began to embark for their own R4 operation, a vast German armada, shrouded in secrecy and the early morning mists, steamed into the North Sea. The stage was set for a dramatic, unforeseen clash. In the crucial hours leading up to the invasion, both Britain and Norway received tantalizing, yet ultimately misread, warnings of the impending German move. On April 8th, a Polish submarine, patrolling the waters off Norway, made a grim discovery. It sank a German merchant ship, the Rio de Janeiro, loaded not with mundane cargo, but with German troops and invasion supplies. The survivors, interrogated by the Norwegians, spoke of their destination: Bergen and other Norwegian ports. The Norwegian Navy promptly informed Oslo of a likely invasion force, but the Norwegian government, tragically, was fixated on another set of reports, those concerning British mine-laying operations. Their minds, conditioned by the Altmark incident and their desperate clinging to neutrality, were attuned to the threat from the west, not the east. They saw the Polish submarine's report as a confirmation of British, not German, aggression. British naval intelligence, too, detected large-scale German naval movements. But their analysts, caught in the prevailing strategic paradigm, misjudged them. They believed the German fleet was attempting a breakout into the North Atlantic, a desperate dash to harass Allied shipping. This misinterpretation was reinforced when the British destroyer HMS Glowworm, a valiant but outmatched vessel, engaged a superior German force led by the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. In an uneven battle, the Hipper eventually sank the Glowworm, but not before the British destroyer, in a final act of audacious defiance, rammed the much larger German cruiser, severely damaging it. This heroic yet tragic encounter only solidified the British belief that they were dealing with a breakout attempt. Consequently, the R4 operation was cancelled. Only then, with the full weight of German naval power revealed, did the British realize the terrifying truth. The German capital ships weren't breaking out. They were screening a massive invasion force. As the 6 German Navy groups, each with its designated target along the Norwegian coast, pressed forward. Their biggest concerns were the very threats that were meant to deter them: mines and Norwegian coastal forts. On paper, Norway's coastal defenses seemed formidable, equipped with a network of forts and minefields. In practice, they barely existed. The mines hadn't been laid, either due to logistical delays or a lingering reluctance to provoke belligerence. The gun crews in many forts were inexperienced, their ammunition stocks sparse. Furthermore, when the first German troops began landing in the early hours of April 9th, sheer confusion reigned. Some brave Norwegian patrol craft engaged the invasion force, but there was little coordinated resistance. In many cases, the German ships, cloaked by darkness and surprise, simply sailed past coastal forts before the alarm could even be raised. But things were different, dramatically different, in Oslo. The capital's defenses, though antiquated, were anchored around the formidable Oscarborg fortress. Perched on a strategic island in the narrowest part of the Oslofjord, Oscarborg was armed with heavy 20 Krupp guns, relics from a bygone era, alongside more modern but still rudimentary underwater torpedo tubes. As German ships, spearheaded by the heavy cruiser Blücher, steamed stealthily towards the capital, their identity still unknown, the fate of Norway hung in the balance. Most secondary forts were unmanned, their garrisons skeleton crews. Yet, Oscarborg's commander, Oberst Birger Eriksson, a man of quiet resolve but steely determination, made a fateful decision. Regardless of nationality, regardless of the political repercussions, he would fire on any intruding vessel. He had sworn an oath to defend his country, and he would uphold it. Meanwhile, aboard the Blücher, Captain Heinrich Voldog was gripped by a dangerous complacency. He simply did not believe the Norwegians would fire. They were neutral, after all. They wouldn't dare. At precisely 04:20 a.m., the Blücher, a symbol of modern German naval might, led the invasion fleet directly into the Oslofjord, smaller vessels fanning out to land troops at coastal forts. The moment the Blücher came into range, Oscarborg's ancient Krupp guns roared to life. The first shells slammed into the cruiser with devastating precision, immediately knocking out its flak fire control, severing vital communication lines, and killing scores of German troops preparing to disembark, still confident in their surprise attack. Smaller guns from the Koppas and Husvik forts joined the cacophony, raining down shells on the unsuspecting German vessel. The Blücher was a warship, yes, but it was not prepared for combat. It was a transport, crammed with troops, equipment, and administrative personnel, not a vessel ready for a pitched naval battle. The ship reacted slowly, its crew caught entirely off guard. Sonderführer Behrens, an officer aboard the Blücher, recalled the terrifying chaos. It was not possible from below to distinguish between hits and our own artillery. Speed was increased. Suddenly the cruiser was violently shaken and shifted sideways. The engines shut down and the lights went out, emergency lighting turning on shortly after. Nobody could tell us what had happened. The ship, meant to deliver the architects of Norway's occupation, was now a mortally wounded beast. Then came the second, more decisive blow. Oscarborg's torpedo tubes, firing torpedoes designed decades earlier, scored 2 direct hits. The blast ignited stored ammunition, sending waves of fire tearing through the ship's decks. With inferno spreading rapidly, Captain Woldag issued the grim order: abandon ship. What followed was a desperate, panicked scramble. Inexperienced troops, many fresh from training, fled in terror, leaving bulkhead doors open, inadvertently accelerating the spread of fire and seawater throughout the ship. The Blücher, once a symbol of German power, rapidly sank beneath the icy waters of the fjord, taking with it hundreds of lives and the meticulous timetable of the invasion. As the Blucher went down, the brave Norwegian gunners, their adrenaline coursing, turned their attention to the heavy cruiser Lutzow, forcing it to retreat from the deadly embrace of Oscarborg. This single act of defiance, this incredible stand by an antiquated fortress, bought Norway something invaluable: time. Oslo's defense, though short-lived, was a crucial strategic victory. After a brief air battle between German Me-110s and Norway's nimble Gloucester Gladiators, German troops eventually landed at Oslo's Fornebu airport and advanced from the landward side, capturing the city by 2 p.m. Gunnar Sundsteby, a 21-year-old student on his way to work, was stunned to see German troops in the streets. "Everyone I met was as stupefied as me," he later recounted. The shock of a neutral nation suddenly occupied etched into his memory. But the brief, bloody resistance at Oscarborg and the subsequent delay provided just enough precious hours for King Haakon VII, his government, and a significant portion of Norway's gold reserves to evacuate the capital, slipping away into the hinterland. By midday on April 9th, despite the setback at Oslofjord, Weserübung seemed an overwhelming success. Germany captured Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, Stavanger, Kristiansand, and Oslo against what was largely perceived as light resistance. Simultaneously, German forces swiftly overran Denmark, which surrendered by 6 a.m., barely offering a whimper of protest. Germany, emboldened by its initial successes, immediately demanded that Norway surrender on the same terms as Denmark. They justified their actions as a necessary preemption of a British invasion, a protective measure. They even offered King Haakon a seemingly generous concession. He could remain king, a figurehead of sovereignty, in exchange for cooperation and legitimization of the German occupation. But before King Haakon could respond, more political drama, even more treacherous, unfolded in Oslo. Vidkun Quisling, the man whose fevered claims had helped spur Hitler to action, was equally surprised by the German invasion. But he was also an opportunist of the highest order. Seizing the moment with breathtaking audacity, he quickly claimed to represent a new Norwegian government. His radio address, broadcast to a stunned nation, was a bizarre mix of betrayal and self-aggrandizement. "Norwegian men and women, England has violated the neutrality of Norway. The German government has offered the Norwegian government its help. The government itself has fled. Under these circumstances, it is the duty and right of the National Samling movement to assume the powers of government. All Norwegians are hereby called upon to keep the peace." It was a desperate grab for power, a man imagining himself the savior of a nation he was simultaneously betraying. Berlin, initially, ignored Quisling, still wary of his inflated sense of importance. But Hitler, ever pragmatic, soon realized the propagandistic and political utility of having a compliant puppet in Norway. He quickly reversed course, publicly supporting Quisling's statement. For King Haakon, however, this presented an agonizing moral dilemma. Surrender to Germany now meant not only capitulating to an invader, but tacitly accepting Quisling as prime minister, a man he knew to be despised by his people, a man whose very name was synonymous with treachery. In Elverum, north of Oslo, away from the immediate German grip, King Haakon gathered his ministers. The weight of his nation's fate rested squarely on his shoulders. His response, delivered with quiet dignity and profound conviction, would become a rallying cry for Norwegian resistance. "My position is clear," he declared. "I cannot accept the German demands. I have carefully examined my mind and my position, and I find that I cannot appoint Quisling prime minister, a man in whom I know neither our people as a whole nor its representatives. have any confidence at all. It was a moment of profound moral courage, a king choosing his people's honor over his own safety. This act of defiance, this unequivocal rejection of Quisling and German demands, transformed the scattered, bewildered resistance into a nascent, defiant movement. Even before the king's powerful announcement, pockets of Norwegian resistance were stirring. Near Elverum, Norwegian troops under the command of Colonel Otto Ruge, a pragmatic and skilled officer, had already repelled a German attack, proving that even outnumbered and outgunned, the Norwegians would fight. Ruge, soon promoted to commander-in-chief of all Norwegian forces, understood the grim reality of their situation. His plan was not to defeat the Germans outright, but to conduct a fighting retreat towards Trondheim, buying time, delaying the inevitable, and desperately hoping for Allied intervention. German units in the south, meanwhile, also pushed north, aiming to link up their scattered forces and consolidate their grip on the country. The battle for Norway, a war of attrition and strategic maneuvering, had truly begun. For Britain, amidst the unfolding chaos, Narvik remained the singular, most vital strategic target. Once the true scope of German intentions became clear, British warships, their initial confusion giving way to grim determination, sailed for the isolated Arctic port. German troops had seized Narvik quickly on April 8th, a seemingly effortless victory. This rapid capture was essential for the German fleet, as the 10 destroyers that had formed the invasion armada were meant to refuel and return to Germany to avoid being trapped by the Royal Navy. However, a crucial logistical failure crippled this plan. Only one fuel tanker arrived on time, delaying the critical refueling operation. This delay, a small oversight in the grand scheme of invasion, would prove catastrophic. In the early hours of April 10th, 5 British destroyers, under the command of Captain Bernard Warburton Lee, materialized out of the poor weather and mist, blocking the fjord exit. Warburton Lee knew he was outnumbered, outgunned, but he also had the element of surprise. He made the audacious decision to attack. As the British destroyers advanced through the swirling snow and low visibility, they evaded German U-boats lurking in the depths and launched a ferocious, unexpected assault on the unprepared German fleet. At 4:30 a.m., British torpedoes struck the German flagship Wilhelm Heidkamp, tearing through its hull, killing the flotilla commander, and turning the ship into a burning wreck. As the British destroyers made more attack runs, they sank the Anton Schmidt and severely damaged 3 other German destroyers anchored in Narvik. It was a stunning display of naval daring, but as the British began to withdraw, 2 German destroyers, the Georg Thiele and Bernd von Arnim, suddenly appeared from a side fjord, surprising the British from an unexpected direction. Sailing in front of the British line, they opened fire at close range, devastating the British flagship HMS Hardy and mortally wounding Warburton Lee. The Hardy ran aground, its guns still defiantly firing, a testament to the courage of its crew. The German destroyers then concentrated their fire on HMS Hunter, which was accidentally rammed by HMS Hotspur in the chaos and suffered significant damage, eventually sinking with heavy losses. Both sides, battered and bruised, now withdrew. Losses were roughly even, but the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. The Germans remained trapped in Narvik, with only 2 undamaged destroyers, and more British ships were known to be on the way. The fjord was becoming a death trap. On April 13th, the second act of the Battle of Narvik unfolded with even greater intensity. 9 fresh British destroyers, led by the majestic battleship HMS Warspite, steamed into the fjord. The German ships, critically low on ammunition and fuel, clung to the hope of protection from U-boats lurking in the fjord's depths. These U-boats launched 4 attacks on the massive warspite, but in a stroke of incredible British luck, all the German torpedoes malfunctioned, either running too deep or failing to detonate. The warspite and its destroyers, now unleashed, relentlessly attacked the crippled German fleet, forcing them to retreat into a narrower fjord where the behemoth battleship could not follow. British destroyers pursued, engaging in a desperate, close-quarters slugfest of torpedoes and gunfire. The German gunnery, despite their desperate situation, was surprisingly accurate. But with nowhere to go, several German destroyers expended their ammunition and ran themselves ashore, their crews scrambling to abandon ship before the British could finish them off. The German destroyer. Erich Giese, however, chose defiance over surrender. It charged bravely at HMS Punjabi and Bedouin, forcing the Punjabi to retreat. At point-blank range, the Bedouin reduced the Giese to a burning wreck, which eventually sank in Narvik harbor. Its captain, facing the inevitable, reflected on his duty. The proper duty of an officer and soldier is to inflict as much damage on the enemy as possible. We had about 10 minutes' worth of ammunition and all torpedoes, so we could fight. But I had no hope that we would ever reach port again. The remaining German destroyers, Georg Thiele and Hans Ludemann, attempted one final desperate ambush with their last remaining torpedoes, one of which scored a hit on HMS Eskimo. Having expended most of their ammunition, they too ran themselves aground, their battered hulks shelled by HMS Hero and Icarus. By the end of April 13th, a decisive naval victory had been achieved. The British had sunk all 10 German destroyers at Narvik. It was a tactical triumph, a clear demonstration of Royal Navy dominance. However, the British, inexplicably, did not immediately land troops, even though the German army units on shore were now isolated and vulnerable, cut off from their naval support. This hesitation, a crucial delay, would prove costly. Instead, the Allies only made their counter-landings around Narvik and Trondheim on April 16th, days after the naval victory. For Colonel Otto Ruge, struggling to organize a fighting retreat against overwhelming German land forces, the help couldn't come soon enough. From April 11th onwards, German forces relentlessly pushed back Norwegian troops in all directions, their motorized units and armor proving superior to the lightly equipped Norwegians. Ruge's strategy was to fight just long enough to delay the Germans, to avoid encirclement, and to prevent his forces from being trapped in static combat against superior firepower. When British troops finally came to Ruge's aid near Lillehammer, he was profoundly disappointed. Many were inexperienced, hastily mobilized, and poorly equipped, a grim reality exacerbated by the loss of a major supply ship, the Cedarbank, to a German U-boat. One British soldier vividly recalled their predicament. Whatever else had been on the Cedarbank, we now had only our rifles, a few anti-tank rifles and Bren guns to face the enemy with, also the clothes we stood up in. This was not the formidable, well-prepared force Ruge had hoped for. These raw British troops performed poorly in their very first encounter with German land forces of the entire war. On April 23rd, German armor easily broke through a British roadblock near Lillehammer, their Stuka dive bombers providing unchallenged air support, terrorizing Allied positions from above. German fighters systematically destroyed all of the aging British biplanes sent to support the expedition within days, establishing complete air superiority. By April 24th, the writing was on the wall. Britain decided to evacuate Trondheim, a bitter pill to swallow. General Edmund Ironside, though recognizing the necessity, knew this would outrage the French, whose troops had only just arrived from the front with Germany. I have now issued the orders for the eventual evacuation of the central Norway force on a military basis, Ironside recorded. He cynically noted, ministers, including the Prime Minister, began making up stories they could tell the public. I dare say they will make a story that can pass muster. The thing that troubles me is that we have not taken the French into account. It was a grim reflection on the political machinations and the desperate attempt to manage public perception amidst a military setback. But even as the Allies withdrew from Trondheim, a separate Allied force was still pushing towards Narvik, where a glimmer of victory still seemed possible. The German commander there, Eduard Dietl, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. He commanded around 4,600 troops, but nearly half of them were sailors, repurposed as infantry, fighting on unfamiliar terrain. He considered withdrawing, his position seemingly untenable. Yet, Dietl, a resourceful and determined officer, received a lifeline. German Ju-52 transport planes managed to deliver vital mountain artillery and supplies, along with German radio and engineering specialists, were smuggled through neutral Sweden. This unexpected logistical support allowed him to dig in. Overall, the British troops lacked aggression, and their advance was agonizingly slow. It took them 2 weeks to advance a mere 8 kilometers north of Narvik, hampered by atrocious weather and cautious tactics. But by late April and early May, fresh French and Polish troops, including elite Alpine experts, began to arrive. The Allied numerical superiority slowly but surely began to make an impact. By late May, the German troops, exhausted and outmatched, faced a combined Allied force of 25,000. The Allies launched their final assault on May 28th, capturing Narvik after a short, fierce battle. Dietl and his remaining troops, broken but not entirely defeated, escaped towards Sweden, where they were interned. The Allies had finally secured a land victory against Germany, a rare triumph in the early days of the war. But it was short-lived, largely symbolic, and ultimately a victory purely to save face. By June 8th, the Allies were evacuating again, their attention now irrevocably drawn to the catastrophic collapse of France. Dietl, barely a week after his retreat, was back in Narvik, reclaiming a ruined prize. King Haakon and his government escaped with the Allies, forming a government in exile, a beacon of hope for a future Norway. Colonel Rugh, the steadfast commander, remained and with his remaining Norwegian forces surrendered on June 10, 1940. The Norway campaign was over. The cost of this campaign was significant for both sides. Germany suffered around 5,300 casualties, including a staggering 2,000 sea, a devastating blow to its nascent navy. Allied and Norwegian losses totaled around 6,600, with approximately 2,500 at sea. Germany, ever adept at propaganda, celebrated Weserübung as a decisive victory. They hailed it as a brilliant preemptive strike that prevented Allied action against the Swedish ore fields and, more importantly, secured vital new naval bases in the North Sea. Meanwhile, a critical post-mortem within Allied command revealed numerous missed opportunities squandered by hesitation, intelligence failures, and cautious, often poorly executed, counter-landings against isolated German troops. Hitler himself, notoriously nervous during the operation, had considered retreating from Trondheim or Narvik several times. He later contemptuously described the Allied inaction as, "From a military point of view, it can only be described as frivolous dilettantism." But was Weserübung truly worth it for Germany? While the campaign suffered relatively light losses on land, it arguably crippled the Kriegsmarine for the remainder of the war. In addition to the magnificent Blücher and the 10 destroyers lost at Narvik, Germany forfeited 2 light cruisers, 6 U-boats, and a critical 10% of their transport capacity. The cream of Germany's surface fleet, including the larger capital ships like Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, required extensive repairs after engagements with the Royal Navy, sidelining them for crucial periods. While the Royal Navy also suffered losses, including the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious during the final evacuation, Britain's vast naval resources meant it could sustain these losses far more easily. For Germany, a navy-poor nation, these were irreplaceable assets. In the longer term, the German occupation of Norway eventually swelled to a staggering 300,000 men, a massive garrison for what quickly became a secondary theater of war. These were troops that could have been fighting on the Eastern Front, defending the Atlantic Wall, or bolstering other critical sectors. Furthermore, ore exports from Narvik, the very reason for the invasion, plummeted throughout the war to negligible levels as Allied blockade and Norwegian resistance choked the supply lines. But in the heady summer of 1940, Hitler was not concerned with these long-term problems. Navies, he believed, were essential for long, drawn-out global wars. His ambition was to fight a short, sharp war, a lightning campaign across continental Europe. Victory in Norway, however costly, added to the growing impression of German military invincibility, a seemingly unstoppable force. It vindicated, in Hitler's mind, the strategy of bold, even reckless, action. As Allied troops evacuated Norway in late May, their hearts heavy with defeat and a sense of foreboding, they already knew Hitler had launched his next major gamble. This new, terrifying offensive would make the Norwegian bases, once so vital, seem almost unnecessary. It was an invasion designed not merely to win a battle, but to win the entire war, the invasion of France. The Norwegian campaign, therefore, stands as a stark lesson in strategic paradoxes, human courage, and the devastating consequences of national neutrality when caught between global titans. It reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming power, individual acts of defiance, an old fort firing its guns, a king refusing to bend, a few destroyers charging against impossible odds, can alter the course of history, even if only by buying a few precious hours. It underscores the profound difference between a tactical victory and a strategic one, and how seemingly minor campaigns can have monumental, unforeseen ripples across the entire canvas of a global war. Ultimately, Norway teaches us that no nation is truly isolated when the great powers clash, and that neutrality, however nobly intended, is often a casualty of war, destined to be consumed by the very fires it seeks to avoid.